Good afternoon, boys and girls. Thanks again for joining us for this week's episode of Flowers and Dissections of Flowers. This is a really great follow up on last week's lesson on plant adaptations. This week, we're going to talk about how the anatomy of a flower works, how pollinators interact with these flowers here, to follow up on what we learned last week about reproduction. And so we're going to look at a few different flowers and learn about how flowers such as these are designed for insects that are a little bit more clumsy, if you will, kind of like beetles. That these serve kind of like a little bit more like a launch pad, if you will, while others are a little bit more intricate and require either insects or birds to kind of get inside of here. Some, if they're long, sometimes are good for animals with beaks, long beaks like hummingbirds and such. Others are really good for things like bees to be able to get in there. And all the while pollinators receive a reward of nectar while they're getting into the flowers, they're ultimately having to pay the price by getting some of this pollen and then taking it to other flowers so that other flowers could then reproduce and bring forth fruit of some sort. So today we're gonna kind of take you real quick through the anatomy of a flower. I want to thank our friends at the San Diego Ecosystem specifically for providing us today's handout of flower dissections. And so without further ado, we'll get right into it. I'd like to start off. We're going to be working with this flower today only because it's a lot easier to work with. And the exterior of it, I want to show you the stem here, this green stem that kind of leads up to what they call the receptacle. And the receptacle is basically the base in which everything in this flower is kind of held in like a cup. And this stem would connect to the rest of the plant, of course. And so while I'll be working with this flower here, I have already gone ahead and got us started on the dissection, just to kind of save us a little bit of time so that you can have more time to do what you want to do out there with your family members in your yard. If you want to buy flowers or pick a flower, I borrowed these from my neighbor. She definitely did not mind. And so we'll start it off with the receptacle, and the receptacle looks like this when it's empty. Here's another example of the one from a flower like the one I just showed you. Here's the inside. So it's kind of just like a vase, if you will. And a receptacle really means container. So it's containing everything that the flower has. The next thing that we would see after the receptacle are all these beautiful petals. Now the petals, the color of the petal or the fragrance of the petal is key in really attracting the different pollinators that it has a relationship with. And so in this case, we've gone ahead and taken off all the different petals from this flower here and put them all to the side. And so what we ended up with after we took off all these different petals is this thing right here, which is actually called a pistil, Pistil. And so the pistil is actually pretty cool because it's actually the male and the female part of the plant. And this one here specifically, although the pistil itself is the female piece, you'll see that on this pistil here, those little granules of pollen are actually the male parts of this flower here. So if we were to take a look at the flower again, we'll see that both the male and the female parts are along the same region. It's not exactly the same for all flowers, but on this specific flower, they kind of, the male parts seem to kind of be growing off of the general female part. And so the pistil itself is actually comprised of three different things. So it's the stigma, the style, and the ovary. And so I'll show you really quick here. If we're looking at the stigma, it's gonna be these red parts out here. It's kind of hard doing this with the camera and the tweezers in my hand. So this would be the stigma here. The style would be this whole body here. And then it takes you down to the ovary, which is, and this region in here. So if we were to actually cut this in half, which I already have, a little bit closer. And so if we were to look at here, you can actually see those little white dots. inside. And those ovules there, if you can see them, those are the ones that would become enlarged when this is fertilized and produce a fruit. So when you eat fruits like an apple, for instance, it's actually one of these little things, but very enlarged, and that's what the actual fruit is. And that's why we always see blossoms before we see actual fruit. Now, for the male side of the anatomy of the flower here, if we take a close look again here at these yellow regions, let me see if I can zoom in nicely. These yellow regions, so these yellow dots that you see there are actual pollen, but it's called the anther. That yellow spot on the end of that little stem, it's called the anther. Together, the anther and the filament, which is that pink, excuse me a second, this pink little stem that's holding on to the yellow pollen there, together they make the stamen. So the stamen is the male part, and the pistil in its entirety is the female part. And so what would happen is that when a bee comes in I'll show you this flower again. When a bee comes in to get some nectar out of this flower here, it'll accidentally rub some of that yellow pollen on its underside, and then when it goes to the next flower, it'll land towards the top, tippy top piece between all those different stigma or red dots, and inside of those, then that pollen would go down the pistil and ultimately into the ovary. So it's going down this whole stem and into one of those, and then it fertilizes one of those ovules, and it bears fruit. And so that's pretty much it for the actual anatomy of the flower. Now, again, the flowers are very different, right? Some are very smelly, sweet smelling. Some might not be so sweet smelling, but they're still attractive by color or by the way that they are structured. In this case here, you see the longer purple things there towards the bottom part of the screen. Those are the male parts. So that would be the anther and the filament, or the stamen, put together. And then those three whitish things there on the top of this one are the stigma that are connected to that long stem there, which is the style, and ultimately goes to the ovary. And those three areas are the female part of this flower here. But again, all flowers look a little different. If we look at this yellow one again, we'll see that on the inside there, you see some longer areas along the sides, right? Might look very different from the flower we previously looked at. And so you see those longer sections on the outside of that ring in the middle, and then the shorter ones there in the middle. And again, also with the rose over here, and you see a lot more stamen and in that pistil, which is just insane, and has a lot of different stigma up at the top there. So different flowers are designed differently and created differently. They look different. They attract different pollinators. But ultimately beautiful flowers with a lot of different purpose. If we didn't have flowers, we wouldn't be able to have a lot of the wonderful things, great tasting things that we get to enjoy, a lot of things that we're able to buy at the stores. So yeah, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. Go out there, have fun, and don't be afraid to check things out. Have a good one.